Right. Welcome to this MERICS Future China Lecture. It is a distinct honor and great joy to host such a timely debate and a terrific guest and speaker, Kevin Rudd, in this hybrid format today here at MERICS. My name is Nikhil. I'm the Executive Director of MERICS and will be your host and moderator today for this conversation. These are turbulent times, and we need frank and open conversations about where China is heading, how relationships with China are developing, and what responses decision makers across the world are finding to do with those developments. This is why we are extremely delighted to have Kevin Rudd, the President and CEO of Asia Society, here today as the first speaker in our Future China Lecture series that is meant to provide orientation and a space for debate on these issues in the coming weeks and months. I would like to introduce our speaker today. Kevin Rudd was Australia's Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, and in 2013 he was also Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2012. Since then you have been President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, started from 2015, and you now split your time between the US and Australia, serving as
heading. And your familiarity with both the United States and China gives friends and allies unique insights into the dynamic changes of policies and perceptions on both sides of this crucial relationship that will shape the course of the 21st century. And what is important to me, you take the agency of other actors, in particular Australia, Asian partners, but also Europe, extremely seriously. We are all no bystanders in this dynamic relationship between the United States and China, and you help us wrestle with our own responsibilities in that regard. And I would like to introduce you to this panel in a minute, but let me say a few words on the substance. In your book, The Avoidable War, which will be at the heart of your presentation today, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict between the United States and China, you have a pretty dramatic entry. You start by saying, "I wish I would not have to write this book." Now, we hope that you will not say the same thing about your briefing and the lecture today, but more seriously, your warning against a looming conflict between two superpowers has unfortunately become even more relevant in the past weeks and months, with the tensions in the Taiwan Strait rising and against the backdrop of the global instability resulting from Russia's invasion in the Ukraine and China's entanglement with these developments. There are three sets of interrelated questions that you all cover in your book, and that we expect some answers today. All of them are extremely timely and pressing. The first is, where is China heading? With the date of the 20th Party Congress now settled for 16th October, just a few days from now, we are looking at a crystallization point of structural trends in Xi Jinping's China that will shape the course of the country for years. Where are US-China relations heading? We know that the fabric of relations is frailing, with upsides, such as the recent tentative agreement on the listing of Chinese companies in the US, but these upsides not outweighing the risks of escalation and further decoupling as they are playing out in front of us. And Taiwan certainly just being the prime example of that. And then, what are our responses? How does, as you call it, managed strategic competition work in practice? And what does all of this have to do with the others, Australia, the world, and us here in Europe? Kevin, welcome to MERICS, and thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to your presentation and input.
Thanks very much for the warm welcome to MERICS, and it's good to be back in Berlin. It's been a while since I've been here. The pre-COVID period was half a lifetime ago, it seems. So it's good to be able to spend time with you all here on this important subject. There's another reason for wanting to come here to MERICS is that I read in the distant American media that you'd been sanctioned by the Chinese government. So I'm here to offer international solidarity with MERICS under these circumstances. I think it's outrageous for the Chinese government to seek to sanction any academic institution anywhere in the democratic world. What China may do itself domestically is ultimately a matter for China. We, however, belong to a system of free countries, free societies, and free discourse. Long may it be that way. The book, which I'm pleased to be able to release here in Berlin, today is entitled The Avoidable War. And as Miko has just suggested, I really didn't want to take a year out of my life to write it, notwithstanding the fact that there's a limit to how much Netflix you can consume during COVID and lockdown. But sitting down to write this book, my mission was fairly clear. For the first time in my long association with the US-China relationship as a student, as a professional diplomat, as a member of parliament, as a foreign minister, as a prime minister, and now as I slide down the other side of the food chain of life to become a think tanker, before I return to probably being a desk officer in the foreign ministry again. It's the first time I've really been concerned about where this relationship is fundamentally going. It's become dangerous. And so when I use the term the avoidable war, it's partly a response to my friend and colleague at Harvard University, Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, which in the United States has achieved a particular cogency and a particular following and a particular interpretation, and an assumption on the part of many that somehow the course of history is now irreversible, as if we're locked into some inexorable outworking of Hegelian forces over which we have no control. And so my essential argument is that agency, political agency on the part of political leaders has power, has influence, and is capable of shaping events, both in Beijing, in Washington, and in other capitals, including Berlin. Let me put my remarks into three sets of issues. The first is this: why has the US-China relationship got to this current stage? The second is, what does Xi Jinping want now that China is in a more competitive position in relation to the United States? And thirdly, how is crisis, conflict, escalation and war avoidable, as I argue in the book? Let me begin on the first, which is how have we got to where we've got to? There's no particular rocket science to this. It's fairly plain in my view. And that's because of the fact that we now have, over the last couple of decades, a growing and intensifying change in the balance of power between China and the United States, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, and particularly in East Asia and the West Pacific. Whether you measure this in purely military terms, whether you measure it in economic terms and the subsets of economic engagement from trade flows, investment flows, capital markets, technology markets, currency markets, or the rest, the balance of power has been shifting. And our Chinese friends have reached that conclusion themselves. And as you know, for those of you who are students of China, the Chinese have a particular method of calculation of this called 综合国力, comprehensive national power. And if you look carefully at the Chinese literature on 综合国力, their calculus over the course of the last decade that Xi Jinping has been in power has engaged language which is increasingly robust and self-confident that China's time has come. Summarized in the most recent rehabilitation of an ancient Maoist axiom of 东升西降, the rise of the East and the decline of the West, in which the West is a term which is a euphemism for the United States. Factor number two is beyond this sort of structural set of conditions concerning the changing balance of power between these two geopolitical entities, is the particular agency of Xi Jinping's leadership. Xi Jinping does not represent leadership continuity from his predecessors. In this respect, I partly part company from an academic work which I nonetheless have enormous respect for, which is Rush Doshi's work on the question of continuity and change between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping on China's overall assertiveness in foreign security policy. Xi Jinping is not a status quo politician. Xi Jinping seeks to change the status quo. If you had any doubt about that, a quick examination of the entrails of the Chinese Conference on Neighbouring State Diplomacy in 2013, 周边国家外交, or on the Foreign Affairs Work Conference held by the Party Centre in November-December of 2014. It's quite plain from both these early conference resolutions by the party on the question of its future direction in foreign policy, that Deng Xiaoping's diplomatic advice, diplomatic notes often as they were described, delivered to the system decades earlier, that China should hide its strength, bide its time and never take the lead, should now yield to a new age of 奋发有为, or striving for achievement. And if anyone had any doubts that that was what was unfolding, the fact that one tifa, one qijiyu, one set of expressions to describe this long-standing doctrine of Chinese diplomatic quietude was yielding to a much more activist phase, it is reflected in this critical change of language in 2013, 2014. And as they say in the classics, the rest is history. Because in the period since then, you've seen one series of diplomatic, foreign policy and other international economic policy and military initiatives following another. As Xi Jinping's dictum to the rest of the system is that it's time for China to reflect its influence in changing its region and changing the international system of which China is part. Anyone who doubts that, have a look at the People's Daily reportage of what Xi Jinping had to say at the Foreign Affairs Work Conference at the end of 2014. We're buried in the verbiage of the People's Daily report. There's one critical phrase which I remember reading at the time, which is 国际秩序之争, a struggle for the international system. 之争, which means from 斗争, and 斗争, a Chinese term, means struggle, which means we are now, as China, with the United States, in a struggle for the future of the international system. This is not me inventing it, that's what the text says. And one thing that I've learnt as a student of Chinese Marxism-Leninism and the habits of ideological systems underpinning them is that changes in the formulations they use symbolise fundamental change in subsequent policy. So the second reason we are where we are is that the leadership patterns, style and habits of Xi Jinping are radically different from his predecessors on the question of the assertiveness of Chinese foreign and security policy. The third reason we are where we are is because since 2017 the United States has decided to respond. Inelegantly at first. Trump by definition was inelegant. The Trump administration was unusual. Some would say very unusual. Having lived myself in the United States during that period, I would say bizarre. But nonetheless, in the midst of the bizarre nature of it all, and the rolling circus act which constituted the daily performance of the Donald Trump three-ring circus, otherwise called the Trump administration, H.R. McMaster at the end of 2017 produced the National Security Strategy. And that document was plain in entombing the previous doctrine as defined by the Trumpites at least of strategic engagement of China and replacing it formally with a new doctrine of strategic competition. And to the surprise of our friends in Beijing, this achieved almost immediate bipartisan consensus between Republicans and Democrats, and to the further surprise of the Chinese system, with the passage of Donald Trump into temporary and hopefully permanent political oblivion at the end of the last election. This has achieved enduring bipartisan support as the organising principle for American national China strategy. And the whole notion of strategic competition between China and the United States is now reflected in one series of policy documents after another emanating from the Biden administration. In other words, the United States, in partnership with its friends and allies around the world, is now seeking to roll back against what China is seeking to do under Xi's leadership. So there is no rocket science to this. The balance of power has changed. China's concluded it has. It's become more activist in the prosecution of its interests and values, both bilaterally, regionally and globally. And the United States has now responded to the agency of Xi Jinping's leadership. That is why we are where we are. Everything else is detail. This brings us to the second point I thought I'd address this evening here in Berlin, which is, if that is the case, then what does Xi Jinping want? It's the question that I get asked most around the world by governments, by political parties, by prime ministers, by presidents, by foreign ministers, by corporate leaders. What does Xi Jinping want? What are his plans for change? What are his priorities for change? And it's for these reasons that I decided over the last several years to take out some time, not just to write this book, but to do an Oxford University research project on Xi Jinping's ideology. So I have this view that in a Marxist-Leninist system, changes in ideology actually become the signalling devices for broader changes in public policy and politics, domestic and foreign. In the book that I'm releasing here, part of it goes through what I describe as 10 concentric circles of interest for Xi Jinping, arranged almost like one babushka doll encompassing another. Let me give you a 30-second summary of each, starting from the inner and most important babushka doll of them all, which is keeping the party in power and keeping me in charge of the party. That's Xi Jinping, not me. Number 2, securing and sustaining national unity, explaining Tibet, explaining Xinjiang, explaining Hong Kong and the repression which has flowed there, and explaining the absolute centrality of Taiwan to the future political project of Xi Jinping himself. Number 3, grow the economy, to not only sustain my social contract with the Chinese people through rising living standards as well as growing employment opportunities in exchange for the political rights which you extend to me, that is the Chinese Communist Party, but also through a growing economy to grow China's national wealth and power, fuqiang, so that China does in fact become the preeminent power once again in the region and the world. Number 4, achieve 3 above now in an environmentally sustainable fashion, because in the past we could treat the environment as an externality in China's economic development project, no longer, because the people don't like dirty air, dirty water or dirty soil, and therefore unsafe food. And as a result, the party from about 2015, 2016 concluded that this was creating such fundamental disquiet across the country they had to act, and particulate matter concentrations in the atmosphere in terms of pollution in China's larger cities directly relates to action on carbon pollution and therefore action on climate change. Number 5, develop the PLA as a modern war-fighting and war-winning machine, for which there is now a timetable through to 2027 for the completion of the reorganisation and modernisation and joint force operations of the PLA to fight and win wars, Xi Jinping's doctrine. Number 6, neighbouring states, all 14 of them, make them economically dependent on China and cause them therefore to become progressively foreign policy compliant with China. And if you look at China's 14 neighbouring states, that's by and large the script that's been pursued, that is, with land neighbours. The most spectacular success has occurred with what was once the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation. Once a long-standing strategic headache for China for reasons of territorial incursions since the days of Peter the Great, periods of economic dependency through the rise of the Soviet Union and the first halcyon days of Sino-Soviet collaboration between 49 and 59. But then following the Sino-Soviet split in the late 50s and early 60s, increasingly a problem until Deng Xiaoping finally resolved the border in 89, and the subsequent 30 years between then and the present representing the gradual normalisation and strengthening of the Russia-China relationship. And since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Crimea in 2014 and again in 2022, you see progressive dependency emerging on the part of Russia to China, putting Russia precisely where China wants it, in a dependent status economically as one of China's principal land neighbours. With India, demonstrably less so. Number 7 is looking to China's maritime periphery to the east to cause the United States to be pushed back beyond the first island chain to the second island chain and arguably even to the third island chain. And this is primarily about scenarios to assert China's territorial agenda over Taiwan, its maritime agenda in relation to the South China Sea, and to secure Chinese sovereignty over Japan's effective territorial claims over Senkaku Diaoyuda in the East China Sea, for which the US military presence and its forward positioning in East Asia and the West Pacific represents an ongoing strategic problem. And therefore, part of this strategy is incrementally to advance an economic and foreign policy agenda which ultimately undermines and fractures US alliance structures in East Asia and the West Pacific. That with Korea, that with Japan, that with the Philippines, that with Thailand, and of course the fifth allied treaty partner in the Asia-Pacific region is the Commonwealth of Australia. Number 8 in this 10 sets of concentric circles, this ever-expanding babushka doll of possibilities, is looking at China's continental periphery to the west, where of course the one salient feature which separates it from the maritime periphery to the east is the absence of the United States. And therefore enter the Belt and Road Initiative and the Belt and Road Initiative Plus, which is to have this pan-continental infrastructure investment initiative across Central Asia, across Eastern Europe, eventually into Western Europe, and certainly into South Asia through the maritime Silk Road, not just the land-based Silk Road, through the Middle East and into Africa. In other words, to see this as an extended geopolitical and geoeconomic corridor of economic opportunity for China. Not just for China then to sell from its massive state enterprises engaged in massive infrastructure investments now in the rest of the world, given that the domestic infrastructure build in China is more or less mature, some would say overly mature, and overinvested, to the rest of the vast Eurasian continent. And having resolved your fundamental geopolitical divide with Russia by other means, making that possible without a fundamental conflict of spheres of influence between the Russians and the Chinese in Central Asia, which would otherwise have been the case. If you look at the 5 stands in particular, all Russian speaking. And again, the object, apart from expanding economic opportunities for China, is to cause this vast Eurasian continent through to the Atlantic to become progressively economic dependent on China's market through the irresistible gravitational pull, quote unquote, from Xi Jinping of the Chinese economy in terms of a market itself, but also prospectively as a source of outbound investment as well. 2 last rings in this increasingly obese babushka doll is China and its interests in Latin America, Africa, and the rest of South Asia and the developing world, not just through the Belt and Road Initiative, but through a range of other initiatives to cause the developing world to become, again, the indispensable economic partners of China, independent, indispensable source of investment and infrastructure, again from China, but also to convert these states into a massive voting bloc for China in the multilateral institutions of the world. The UN, the Bretton Woods institutions where they are relevant, but also in other standard-setting bodies across the international system. And you simply have to look at how China can marshal votes in any given multilateral candidature to know how effective this can be. And look how quickly troublesome ambassadors in New York can be dispatched back to capitals should they happen to misbehave from China's national interest point of view. Which brings me to number 10, and the widest periphery of this Michelin man of Babushka dolls, right out here, is rewriting the rules of the international system itself to make the international system over time more compatible with Chinese national interests and national values. You might say, well, hasn't China so far largely played within the rules of the international system? You could say that from the 70s and joining the UN Security Council in place of China, yes, China essentially adopted a passive posture and would only take an active posture when its own direct and immediate national security interests were at stake, but otherwise would, consistent with Deng's advice over time, bide its time and never take the lead. Progressively, however, what we've found that China is now contesting international candidatures, seeking the leadership of international positions, deploying large numbers of staff into the UN system and other multilateral institutions, as well as creating its own multilateral and plurilateral institutions outside the remit of the UN and Bretton Woods system. So that in terms of the formal multilateral system, post-44-45, one which increasingly has more Chinese finance, more Chinese personnel, more Chinese, as it were, institutional impact on the ground, but parallel to that, a set of Sinocentric institutions, of which the BRI, of course, is one of a number, including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as well. And the ultimate logic of that is to extend Chinese wealth and power to its final remit, but also to have an international system which increasingly reflects Chinese national interests and values, which the Chinese have concluded is what the United States did after World War II in reflecting its interests and its values in the San Francisco Conference and at Bretton Woods in crafting the post-war order. With one final addition from China's point of view, if you can strip out universal human rights norms from various UN international instruments, not just in the Human Rights Council, but those from the Security Council as well, norms which come from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948, which China is also a national signatory and ratification state, albeit having done by the nationalists 1 year before 49, that China would prefer an international order which does not provide a continuing normative challenge externally to China's internal revolution and China's internal resolution that rights are fundamentally sovereign rights and at broadest economic rights, not individual civil and political rights. In other words, you remove the external normative challenge, which comes from not just the United States, not just from a whole bunch of Europeans, but ultimately anchored in the precepts of 1948 and taken up later in the 60s through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I often have that effect when I speak. Third thing I said I'd discuss this evening is, given all the above, which is the factors which have combined to bring about the current state of US-China relations, and the sets of intersecting ambitions of Xi Jinping's administration in China, which is likely to continue not just for the next 5 years following the 20th Party Congress, but in my judgment, for the one after that and the one after that, depending on his longevity, is that the United States and its partners and allies therefore faces Xi Jinping's China, which is a non-status quo power seeking to change domestic and international realities along the lines I've just described. So what are our options? Right now, between the United States and China, we have what I could best describe as unmanaged strategic competition. There are no rules of the road out there. It is basically a rolling geopolitical game of push and shove. If you look, for example, at what happens on the high seas of the South China Sea on a given day, around Scarborough Shoals, around any other part of the South China Sea, you see Chinese deployments, you see Allied counter-deployments. If it's over Taiwan, as we've seen most spectacularly in the period following the Pelosi visit, a series of Chinese actions, a series of American responses, albeit belated, as well as now the rolling of the dice in terms of Chinese power passage over the median line in the Taiwan Strait itself through aircraft overflight. Or in the East China Sea, that if you look at the data which is produced by our friends in Tokyo on the number of incidents and near incidents on a daily basis between various elements of the Chinese state, whether it's fishing vessels or customs vessels or just beyond the horizon, naval frigates, units of the PLA Navy, Plan, and certain Air Force units as well, causing the Japanese Self-Defense Force and its Air Force to mobilise each day to throw units back to challenge violations of Japan's claim to territorial sovereignty over not just the islands, the 4 of them, but also the surrounding seas. Push and shove, push and shove. It also happens in cyber and space. And so the question for all of us is that becoming increasingly untenable as the best guarantor of continued strategic stability, or does it create instead a series of incentives, possibilities, and probabilities even for one of these pushes and shoves to get out of control? I'm sure it never happens in German playgrounds, but in Australian playgrounds, when I've seen push and shove happen between a couple of 7-year-olds, it works usually for the first couple of grounds until one kid falls over. And then it's on for young and old. I'm sure German kids are much better behaved than Australian kids. But my experience out there is that this may not always be the case. And therefore, that's what unmanaged strategic competition is like. Once tenable, but once you get to a point of so many assets, full military assets as well as grey zone assets being deployed in a limited geographical space, the mathematical probabilities of an incident occurring become much greater. And what history tells us is that when incidents occur, the capacity for escalation, crisis, conflict and war become much greater, as the politics of nationalism also intervene. The alternative, and the burden of the argument of the book, is managed strategic competition. MSC, I call it. And that's not the Munich Security Conference, even though I caught up with Wolfgang Ischinger this morning. MSC, as I argue it, has got 3 essential principles, and I'll conclude at this point. The first is within these 5 strategic red line areas, which are Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, nuclear proliferation, and cyber and space. There's 2 sides through working groups to identify each side's irreducible strategic red lines. There will never be agreement on this, but it is useful for the other side to know the conclusions of the other side as to what they consider to be their irreducible strategic red lines. One of those might include observing the symbolisms and the substance of the One China policy. Another may include, for example, China signing off, not signing off, but knowing that if it was to engage in a wholesale cyber attack to bring down the civilian economic and political infrastructure of Taiwan, would be regarded as a hostile act by the United States under the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act. I simply use those for illustrative purposes. But the argument overall within this first pillar of managed strategic competition, that it's far better to have those and a team of the most senior officials, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defence, National Security Advisor and Chinese equivalents, responsible for the day-to-day policing of this. So you reduce, though never eliminate, the risk of accidental conflict, escalation, crisis, conflict and war. The second element of MSC, Managed Strategic Competition, is that if you can do Part A above, is that can you then have non-lethal strategic competition across the rest of the relationship? In other words, there is still a highly competitive race in the rest of security policy, the rest of foreign policy, the rest of economic policy, in trade and investment, in capital markets, in currency markets, and technology markets. And ultimately, in the market for ideas, the ideological contest between our notion, the democratic world, of a liberal democratic order anchored in the rules of the international system, or an alternative order which is constructed around the concepts of state sovereignty, ultimately anchored in the realist grounds of the geostrategic power of China itself. And as I say in the book, may the best system win in such a concept or in such a non-lethal strategic competition. And the final pillar of managed strategic competition is this: creating at the same time, through this joint strategic framework, sufficient political and diplomatic space for there still to be strategic collaboration in critical global public goods, such as climate change, such as global financial stability, such as global public health, such as nuclear non-proliferation, where the national interests of both sides command such cooperation to exist, but at the same time is of fundamental benefit to all of us. Some have argued this is all terribly pie in the sky. Thank you very much, Kevin, go away. My argument is that we can all be bystanders in this if you want, and just watch the inexorable forces of history, Hegel at work, driving these two great countries and two great civilizations inexorably in the direction of a crisis point, of a conflict point, of a point of war. I'm a bit old-fashioned. I actually don't like war. I know it's an old-fashioned view these days. And I'm all for constructing as many off-ramps as we can. Off-ramps, however, which are deeply mindful of the power and the potency of deterrence and the power and the potency of sustaining the freedoms that we in the democratic world have secured so far, not just here in what's called the West, but the wider democratic world across the world. And my challenge to those who critique what I put forward is, please come up with a different idea about how this can best be done, how we can reduce the risks of accidental crisis, conflict and war for the decade ahead. I'm all ears, and I'd be happy to shred the book tomorrow if someone could come up with an alternative. But I launched this book 3 months ago in the United States. I'm still waiting for the alternative to be produced. I don't see it yet. And so therefore, it is an idea that out there waiting to be challenged and contested. But on its historical antecedents, I would conclude with this observation. The United States and the Soviet Union came close to a near-death experience in 1962. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And after that, through a very untidy process, the Americans and the Soviets incrementally agreed upon a series of arrangements to reduce the possibilities of catastrophic conflict in the future. So what then happened? We had 30 more years of the Cold War, and here in Berlin, you know exactly what that meant. You still had the Iron Curtain, you still had the wall in Berlin. You still had proxy wars in multiple states across Africa and Latin America and elsewhere between the Soviets and the United States and its allies. And you had a massive ideological competition between the notions of Soviet-inspired international communism versus the alternative order. But we didn't come close again to blowing each other's brains out. That's because the systems concluded it was unwise to do that. My simple and humble counsel is, at least at that level, we could learn from those who have gone before us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for this inspiring lecture. And I look forward to having many of the colleagues here in the audience buy and get a signed copy of your book later. But before we get to that fun part, I wanted to start with a few questions to kick our discussion off, and I invite everyone in this room also to share your questions and comments later. You built an easy bridge for the first question here. We're not idle bystanders in this conflict. So I wanted to start you off, if I can, with a question on the role of Europe and the others in that competition. And what you think is that everyone needs to take away from that picture that you've painted, which is one of great risk. And as we mentioned earlier, there's quite a set of big questions looming, including the political trajectory of China, the tensions around Taiwan, but other elements of that strategic competition that you've painted here. So what is the role of Europe? What is the role of others in managing that strategic competition?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nico. We're not powerless bystanders unless we so choose to be. Germany and Australia, for example, are both allies of the United States, albeit in different theatres. Germany and Australia are both friends of China and have been for half a century. And so we all have agency in both capitals. The core understanding, I think, for us all to be mindful of is that there is nothing conceptually incompatible between effective deterrence and effective diplomacy. Someone reminded me of this earlier today when we talk about Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik here in Germany. I'm no expert in the period, I'm just an Australian. But when Brandt was pursuing Ostpolitik, German armed forces were about 500,000. German defence outlays were 4% of GDP. This was all at the height of the Cold War. Willy Brandt was not a pacifist. Willy Brandt actually ensured that the diplomacy of Ostpolitik rested on the assertion of German power and the ability to defend the country. So the thesis that I seek to advance in the broader conceptual debate here in terms of China, the United States and American allies is that actively participating in deterrence in partnership with the United States, both in Asia and in Europe, or in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, is of itself necessary so that our friends in China do not conclude that they face an easy opportunity to take Taiwan by force. And deterrence is not just a military concept, it's equally an economic and financial concept. It's a political and foreign policy concept, each of which constructs a series of massive costs if in fact that course of action is to be embraced. The military cost is, or the risk is, I might lose because the other mob have got so much power, either individually or between them. In this case, principally, the United States and Taiwan, conceivably with other allies as well. Financially and economically, what will the Chinese system conclude if in fact the world embraces at scale financial and economic sanctions against China in the event of armed action against Taiwan? Well, it could well cripple the Chinese economy, given that the traded sector of the Chinese economy is now still about 38% of GDP. And if you think about the impact of that on Chinese growth numbers, and net exports being a driver of Chinese growth for the last 40 years, it's not an inconsequential consideration. And being left in the foreign policy isolation ward, like the North Koreans are today, by states around the world saying violation of the principles of the peaceful resolution of conflict cannot just be easily pushed to one side. Hence why the world has reacted in the way in which it's reacted to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's the deterrence box. If deterrence, which is about, frankly, force, and about the application of leverage, prospective, possible, in order to induce different behaviours from the other side, then diplomacy can be constructed on that basis, which is in the direction of, let's consider, therefore, a framework of managed strategic competition on the way through so that we reduce at the same time the risks of crisis, conflict and war. And that's where, again, we all have agency. We have agency to be suggesting to the Americans and to the Chinese, it's not in anybody's interest for you, both of you, to keep pushing this to the precipice, to the limit, to a high level of risk. Because the consequences for the world of an outbreak of war in the Taiwan Straits, given that it's very difficult to conceive of a limited war scenario over Taiwan, if you actually sit down and do the scenarios, the consequences for the global economy will be catastrophic. The consequences for global collaboration on anything will be catastrophic, quite apart from the catastrophic loss of life on Taiwan itself and in and around the region. So, for those reasons, there is a role for Europe and other countries who are friends and partners of the United States in the collective actions of deterrence and what the strategic literature would call rebalancing, to sustain stability through an ongoing balance of power. And that's not incompatible with prosecuting a diplomacy around the principles of managed strategic competition. In fact, you cannot advance diplomacy if you are powerless. You can only advance diplomacy if you have a credible claim to power as well.
Let me stick with the topic of Taiwan for a second, and it's probably expected, but at the same time remarkable how central in your 10 scenarios that you paint in this book, how central Taiwan is to that. I think it's in 5 of 10 of your scenarios it plays the critical role. And it's hard to predict, as you say also in your book, how exactly developments will play out. But I wanted to get your baseline assessment of that situation at the moment, which is highly dynamic. It has lots of different moving parts. There is a change in the status quo, probably from all sides to some extent. We have a new, fragile, new normal in the Taiwan Strait. What is your baseline assessment of the Taiwan Strait stability and how this is likely going to play out? I know it's a question about your predictive capabilities, but if anyone, it's probably you who can respond to that question.
Thank you. There are 3 sets of variables, as you just pointed to, but arguably a 4th as well, which is the rest of us. Number 1 variable is the Taiwanese themselves, what they do in terms of the management of the one China policy in their domestic politics. This is not inconsequential. My objective, and I think shared by most folks on Taiwan, and I studied there as a student, I love the place, robust little democracy, strong economy, produces the world's most advanced microchips, gay law reform, gay marriage. You don't find many entities like that in let's call it the Eastern Hemisphere. So therefore, I'm all for maintaining the status quo. That's kind of where I come from. I'm not in support of Taiwanese independence because I think that is playing with fire and in fact arguably makes the idea of maintaining the status quo infinitely less tenable. So the volatility question on the part of the Taiwanese as they move into their next set of presidential elections, Tsai Ing-wen, who I think has been remarkably responsible on the question of the one China policy, and what therefore the Democratic Progress Party's presidential primaries produce in terms of positioning on Taiwanese independence as they seek support to become the DPP candidate for the presidential elections at the end of 23? That's right. Sorry?
1 year later, I think, right?
24? Yeah, anyway, sorry, it's been a long flight from Delhi. So that's variable number 1, where we have a combined responsibility to say to the Taiwanese, don't go there, vis-a-vis the I word, the independence word, in the way in which the debate is conducted. And that's why, frankly, I'm still a supporter of the what is now seems the ancient American doctrine of strategic ambiguity. You don't want to provide Taiwanese domestic politics with total license to go out there and say and do whatever it wants on the independence question and expect someone else to clean up the wreckage afterwards. So that's part 1 in the equation. Part 2 is Uncle Sam. One of the reasons I've been critical of the Pelosi visit is because it fools around with the symbols of the one China policy. Not because I disapprove of parliamentarians going to Taiwan at all. I've been to Taiwan as a parliamentarian. I haven't been as a foreign minister. I haven't been as a prime minister. And the problem with the Pelosi visit was that as Speaker of the House, she's the 3rd most powerful person in the United States under the Constitution. So the Chinese can technically actually pull out the foul card and say this is fouling Taiwanese independence. This is fouling the one China policy. So what I'm concerned about is that the Pelosi visit upsets the status quo, has enabled the PLA to run a whole series of military exercises that they would not easily have the luxury of doing, and the political environment in which they were able to execute it. War game what it's like to blockade the island, to interrupt maritime trade and air traffic, which is what they did, and to come out of all that saying, well, that's not too bad actually. But here's the real rub, which is what does the Pelosi visit do in terms of the Republican presidential contest in the United States as they seek to contest one another for the most forward-leaning, hairy-chested, out-there policy on Taiwan in order to secure the Republican voter base for the presidential primaries. That's what worries me, and you already see in the debate people like Pompeo beginning to position themselves around de facto Taiwanese independence. This worries the hell out of me. So that's variable number 2. Variable number 3 is Chinese themselves. I don't think the Chinese military intention is to move towards a planned action against Taiwan this decade, because they're not financially, economically or militarily prepared yet. The risks are still too high on those different counts. Their planning, in my judgment, is to be in a position of being able to deploy overwhelming military and financial and economic force next decade, not this decade, from early next decade, and still therefore within Xi Jinping's political lifetime. So these are the 3 sets of variables. So how does it turn out against the scenarios? Look, I'm an old-fashioned optimist from Australia. You know, I'm a social democrat, therefore we're trained to be optimistic. Otherwise, why would you get out of bed of a morning? Mind you, a conservative just get out of bed to make money, don't you? So we old-fashioned social democrats have a worldview which says, if you combine rational deterrence, thank you, with real-world diplomacy along the lines that I sought to argue before, as far as managed strategic competition is concerned, then the scenario I outline in the book, which I want to prevail, which is the deterrence prevails, is we manage to navigate the 30s through effective deterrence, having got through the 20s on the basis of managed strategic competition. And beyond that, it may just be that Xi Jinping, goes off to meet Marx, and we come back to a different set of Chinese realities. But that's the long term. I'm concerned about surviving the 20s.
Final question for me before we hand over to the audience here. Again, trying to take up some of the thoughts that you've put out in the book. You speak of a forecast deceleration on the economic picture in China, where we've seen, I think, rosy pictures, hopes and projections about the eternity of linear growth projections in China evaporating quite quickly over the past months and years. Do we see, and I'm getting more at the politics of it, do we see an acceleration of political forces in China centered around Xi Jinping and his political package that he represents? And what is that package that we are now expecting at the 20 Parties Congress to be, put out all front on our desks?
Whatever it is, it'll be very long. Congress reports by the Communist Party General Secretary are invariably very long documents. And part of our job in the analytical community is to make sense of the complex. I think the first point I'd say is that I do not see at this stage Xi Jinping fundamentally changing the economic ideology he outlined at the 90th Party Congress. An economic ideology which has authorised a series of what I describe as Marxist interventions in the previous market economy model of the Chinese economic system, in support of the state-owned enterprise sector, against the private sector, assaults on the tech sector, the property sector and the finance sector, and as a result, declining economic growth. All of which, if you like, is not in China's rational economic interests, but at the same time is in Xi Jinping's ideological and political interests, because it controls the power of the aggregate private sector and any long-term challenge it represents to the power of the Communist Party itself. So at that level, I'm not anticipating a change back towards a more market model, because that would be too face-losing, 丢脸方面的 for Xi Dada, for Uncle Xi. So the second thing, though, is that because the economy is weakening so much, there may be, in the non-ideological components of the Party's General Secretary's report to the Congress, a more mixed set of messages about economic policy settings, which try to re-achieve a balance between market and control between private sector and state sector, between entrepreneurial incentive and state planning and industrial policy. I mean, the classic polarities of the Chinese economic policy debate. However, if that is done in the absence of more underlying ideological change back towards the market of the type that we saw under Deng Xiaoping for 35 years, then I fear that the net outcome for the real Chinese economy will be continuing to muddle through with suboptimal economic growth rates of trend growth in and around 3, as opposed to what the Chinese economy at this stage of its economic development should be growing at, which is more around 6, because it is still a developing economy with much underutilised capacity still within it. So that's the second point. Thirdly, of course, we'll focus on personnel. I've been around looking at party congresses since the 12th Party Congress. So this will be my 8th Party Congress. That really does start to date you. You feel like a fixture on the wall of a Party Congress itself. So I've kind of given up the idea of just picking names for the sake of picking names, because it's a hazardous and not entirely productive exercise. But here is the key point for us all when the names are eventually produced for the other members of the Standing Committee and of the Politburo itself. Number one, for the first time in 20 years, we don't have the emergence of any candidate so far to replace Xi Jinping himself. There should have been one in place 5 years ago on the normal 2-term roster basis, but there is none. If I was to ask you across the rest of the Politburo and the Standing Committee, who would replace Xi Jinping if he went tomorrow, none of us would know, because that work hasn't been done, even though orderly succession was the directive of Deng, Jiang and Hu. The second point is this. The critical debate about China's geopolitical and geoeconomic future is, can they revive the economy? In part, that will hang off the ideological and policy positions that I referred to before, which become clear or opaque through the General Secretary's report to the Congress. But who he appoints as Premier of the State Council to implement it. If there's no fundamental ideological or policy change, he could appoint Milton Friedman as the Prime Minister of the State Council to drive the economic reform agenda. And the response across the economic system would be a giant yawn, because they know that the new Premier would not be empowered ideologically to return to a market orientation in the overall economic architecture of the system. So the personnel appointments are symbolically significant. They become really significant if the Premier of the State Council is given a genuine ideological and policy mandate to accelerate growth by restoring market confidence with the private sector. That's when the personnel appointments really matter. And if he was to appoint someone like Hu Chunhua, former party secretary from Guangdong, as you know, the Chinese axioms, the further south that you've served in the system, usually the more progressive you are on the economy, because it's the further you are from Beijing. It's been that way since the Han Dynasty, by the way. But that's when the personnel appointment would be relevant.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for this first set of responses to difficult questions that we all face. So I would expect that we have a microphone running through here, and questions are open. And I would like to collect first maybe 3 questions that I see here. The gentleman in the front. And if you could bring the microphone over here, thank you. And then the colleague behind him, and then here in the front. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. I have 2 questions. The war, Russia's war in Ukraine, what did it do to China? What was the impact on China? What conclusion did the Chinese leadership draw? And did it change the war and its consequences, change somehow their geopolitical calculation? And second question is, how will China now navigate between sticking to its junior partner, Russia, on the one hand, and avoiding a more antagonistic reaction from the West in terms of sanctions, on the other hand?
Before if you want to respond, please.
If I could
yes.
take these one at a time, mainly because Delhi factor is kicking in, and
Right.
if you asked me to remember 3 questions, I could have an early Alzheimer's attack. And so let me just...
Absolutely, sure.
I'll be very quick, though, in response to each. Answer to your first question is not a lot. I think we artificially assume that China is pored over its maps every morning to conclude what's the significance of all this for us in Taiwan. I think the PLA and Xi Jinping have been marching to their own timetable on Taiwan for quite a long time. And I don't think Ukraine disturbs that one way or the other. The caveat is, on financial and economic sanctions, which brings in your second part of your question, they will have noted that there's been unusual European solidarity on a Ukraine question, on Ukraine, because they were all convinced by the Ruskies in particular that Europe was one big large wobbling bowl of marshmallow, geostrategically, and therefore would never get its act together on doing anything robust on anything, including the Eurovision Song Contest. That was kind of the default position over there. And then lo and behold, the Euros got together and said, this is serious. There's an attack on state sovereignty. It's a violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. This cannot be treated as business as usual. And you had Zeitenwende, is that right?
Correct.
And that's my German word of the month. I don't speak a word of German. But Zeitenwende is occurring right over Europe. So I think the Chinese have looked at that with a view to how do they financially hardwire themselves for a decade's time. And that involves measures around eventually floating the renminbi, opening the capital account, and establishing a more robust equivalent of the international dollar-denominated SWIFT system for clearinghouses around the world. Whether they'll do that or not, because my colleague here from the World Bank is shaking his head profoundly, and I tend to agree with him, but let me tell you, this is the rolling seminars inside the system. And the ultimate deterrence question on Taiwan hangs around that and whether they can hardwire themselves against that risk, as well as hardwire themselves in terms of their ability to execute shock and awe militarily, given when they stand back and looking at the long-playing Putin videos of the Red Army spluttering out on the road to Kiev and concluding that Putin was just a giant dummy, which I think is the ultimate take-out message in Beijing as well.
Colleague here in the back, in the front, but behind in the third line. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask you more in the economic realm. How do you see in your vision of strategic competition when it comes to the entanglement and landmark legislation pieces such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the US? How will that unfold? How will economic entanglement continue, or will it be untangled, or what is your assessment on that?
The answer to it is untidy. There is no neat description for what is unfolding, either initiated by Washington or Beijing. On the Washington end, everyone rolls around the place and says, decoupling, 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 and then assume that it all just happens. Decoupling is a many-headed, hydra-headed monster. There's trade decoupling. There's FDI decoupling. There's capital markets decoupling. There's currency markets decoupling. Well, except the renminbi barely exists in international currency markets because it's not floated, and the capital account remains closed. There's technology markets decoupling, talent markets decoupling, distrust of Chinese nationals, etc. So where does this spectrum of decoupling start and stop in terms of the Washington-initiated set of measures? Not on trade. Trade is still bouncing along. Some impediments, but despite all the craziness of Trump's tariffs, I mean, I'm a free trader from way back. I just think tariffs are dumb. They're taxes on working class people. On foreign direct investment, there is a real slowdown. So that's decoupling, if you like. Capital markets, they've just agreed on a new set of accounting standards to manage listings on the New York Stock Exchange as a contra-indicative trend. Technology markets, semiconductors, depending on the category, not generically. The rest, quantum computing, AI, synthetic biology, yes, no, yes, no, yes. And then talent. Well, the Americans have lifted most of their visa restrictions now on Chinese workers going to the United States. One of the least reported elements of the changes under the Biden administration. But that's happened. So therefore, decoupling is untidy from the American end. From the Chinese end, we should reflect on this, however. Xi Jinping, in my judgment, ideologically, and I'm sorry for overusing that term in this discussion, but I'm an old ideology man, because he is, and we've got to understand the way in which Xi Jinping thinks and works within a Leninist system. Ideologically, his mantra is the dual circulation economy. His ideological mantra is national economic self-sufficiency, 自力更生. His national ideological mantra on the economy is the new development concept, all of which are quite mercantilist, all of which are quite protectionist, all of which are non-globalist, frankly. So when the Americans assume that all the discretion lies with them about decoupling, small d or capital D, and across all categories, we need analytically to think through this question, which is there are many decoupling discretions which lie with the Chinese as well, which de facto they are beginning to implement, again, untidily.
Thank you. Intellectual tour de force, the colleague here in the front with probably another set of questions in a different direction.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear that you are so optimistic concerning the timeline concerning a possible attack. I think that
I read Kant, not Hegel, so I'm
yes,
an optimist.
I think it's become more and more difficult to try to defend Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen often said it's an island of resilience. This is already a problem because you know, they have not a long military service time, only 4 months. They try to enhance it, but until it's not the case, I ask after Pelosi, for example, what could Taiwan do if they would invade more to the territorial waters of Taiwan? What could Taiwan do? What could the United States do? Because the Chinese have already the possibility to hold American aircraft carriers in a larger distance. I could imagine that there could be an attack earlier, not in the 30s. So, what could be done against it? Of course, there's already an arms race. Even Australia is involved concerning submarines, but they are still not.
Germany is now 2%. That's an arms race.
They are still not existing. Should the United States give up this so-called strategic ambiguity? Biden did already spoke sometimes very problematic. Could it be better if they would say, yes, if you attack, if you want to change the status quo, and they are changing the status quo, they are going over the medium line, they are nearby Taiwan in the territorial waters. The United States could perhaps say, okay, if you change the status quo, we give up the ambiguity, we will defend Taiwan.
So
I think I've got the thrust of the question.
We have two questions here already, I think. One,
yes, no,
one
I want
is
to
what
say,
can Taiwan do?
Would it be, I say this to deter Chinese, that you understand. And one question still. I've read that Dr. Alexander Huang, maybe you know him, is a security expert. He belongs to the Kuomintang. He said, if the United States would really defend us, they should bring American soldiers to Taiwan. We should make common maneuvers together. If not, in a case of attack, there would be chaos and friendly fire.
So, what can Taiwan do, and should the US give up strategic ambiguity? Two big questions, and then moving on to others in the room if they want to.
The book outlines multiple scenarios for a Chinese assault on Taiwan. A massive amphibious attack is just one of them. But the others are naval blockade, maritime interdiction, air traffic interdiction, cyber attack to bring down the economy internally, amphibious invasion, or salami slicing if you took pieces of Taiwan's offshore islands away from Taiwan. The latter, by the way, I've never ruled out because the political intention of taking Jinmen, for example, or Mazu, one of the small islands just off the coast, would be to cause the Taiwanese to conclude that they couldn't defend it and to challenge the Americans to come forward and defend it, knowing that the Americans could not summon the domestic political will to defend a Taiwanese offshore island 12 kilometres off the mainland coast. It's quite different from an attack on the main island of Taiwan. So there is a spectrum of possibilities. That's my first point. The second is, all I know from my own dealings with the Americans over the years as Prime Minister, as Foreign Minister of Australia, is that there is multiple in-depth contingency planning by the United States in relation to each of these scenarios. The United States has war plans for not putting out the milk of a morning. I mean, there are war plans for every conceivable scenario. That's what Indo-Pacific Command, previously Pacific Command in Honolulu, does for a living. And we Australians at various times are deputy commanders of Indo-Pacific Command through the integrated operation of our two armed forces in the Pacific. So this is highly textured and detailed, the work that's already done. And furthermore, within the American remit, a massive rebuild of America's and modernisation of its deterrent and warfighting capabilities in the West Pacific is underway. So we should not simply assume that this is a lay-down military misère, that is, as a simple military procedure for the Chinese, which brings me to my third point. Remember that if it is an amphibious invasion or an airborne invasion, this is by far and above the largest amphibious operation since D-Day and much bigger than D-Day, frankly, than 1944. This is huge. And it's 180 kilometres, for God's sake. It's not 18 miles across the English Channel with a bit of bad weather. You know, it's a massive logistical undertaking. Finally, what can the Taiwanese do? The Taiwanese, in my judgment, have been woefully negligent in maintaining their own national defence. They have allowed their military conscription to slip, as you've correctly observed, sir. They have not significantly increased their national defence budget, and I'm worried about them sliding into dependency theory with multiple congressional visits, taking, I think, the false signal that the Americans would defend them under any contingency in the future. What's the message from Ukraine? Everyone expected the Ukraine to fall in the first week. They didn't. They defended their country through a whole bunch of, frankly, relatively well-prepared military operations, despite the fact that Zelensky, at the end of the day, didn't expect it to come, as many in the foreign policy community didn't expect it to come. But the Ukrainian porcupine defence did work. Will the Taiwanese work? It can work because it's an island, and islands are much harder to get to than rolling across Highway 1 from Moscow to Kiev. So therefore, implicit in your question is that this is easy for the Chinese. It's not. The degree of difficulty is very high. And I think one of the reasons why both sides are currently deterred is because the risks for both sides are too great of misadventure.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front. Undine, if you could pass on the microphone here.
Kevin, your convincing concept of MSC obviously begs the question of how you get from A to B. And with your long experience, diplomatic experience, you must have given a lot of thought on what precise, concrete steps might offer themselves, very practically, in terms of timing windows of opportunity, events, actors, levels of action, the issues to pick to start? What's, in a sense, your theory of change there?
Yeah, it's a great question. A bit like MERICS, we, the Asia Society, see ourselves as a think tank and a do tank. And that is, we're not just interested in learned policy papers. If you want to do that, go to university. There should be more of it. And I just have. And I spent some time at university. But if I'm not in active politics and policy, the whole purpose of being a think tank is to help move the dial in a different way. Secondly, my theory of change has been to get a book out. Earlier, an article summarised the arguments in the book as soon as the Biden administration took over last year, in order to cause the administration to start thinking through what MSC would look like for them and how it could be operationalised in their initial summitry with Xi Jinping. If you look carefully at the language of Biden, Blinken and Sullivan, they have increasingly used concepts of managed competition and the need for strategic guardrails. I don't claim any particular parentage of all this. I'm sure others have been contributing to this debate as well. But you begin to see the Americans groping towards a framework to stabilise this beast, that is the US-China relationship. On the Chinese side, it's quite interesting. To my great surprise, Global Times, which has routinely attacked me in the past, asked for a long article from me on managed strategic competition about 6 weeks ago, which was published in a full-page piece. Now, I know enough about Global Times, 全球时报, to know that they don't just spontaneously combust with editorial independence and say, this is a great idea to pursue. We're still in the age of 实事求是, seeking truth from facts, and therefore let's just see how Kevin's idea flows here. I presume there's a level of official permission in kicking the idea out there. I think the Chinese will not necessarily be married to the idea of strategic competition because it's such a distance from the current Xi Jinping formulation on the US-China relationship, which is peace, brotherhood and universal love. The official formulation is mutual, no conflict, no confrontation, respect for each other's political systems, and, wait for it, win-win cooperation. And 双赢, 还可以. And so the problem with that is, that formulation goes down like a lead balloon in Washington. It just doesn't fly. So the real theory of change lies in working with our Chinese friends, despite the disruption of the Pelosi visit, on conceptual equivalence of that phrase, which gets around the Chinese reservations on nomenclature, particularly as it relates to direct strategic competition, to nonetheless construct strategic guardrails with them. And I think there's an appetite for that, because I don't think our Chinese friends have an interest or appetite for armed conflict now. I think they still think there's a way to go before they feel confident enough to push any buttons. And as I said, our medium-term interest lies in still deterring that at that time. So that's my theory of change, and that's why I got very grumpy with Nancy Pelosi, because she blew everything up on the way through. Unnecessarily, in my view, self-indulgently, with an active political bravado. Ask yourself this about the Pelosi visit. Is Taiwan's security better or worse after the Pelosi visit?
I think yes.
I don't.
If you want to speak, you need a microphone.
Yeah, sure.
And brilliant if you can turn it into a question and a short comment. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
You are worried about military conflict.
Yeah.
Don't you think that not being clear about your own position is the most likely cause to conflict?
No, because you've got a third player here, which is Taiwanese domestic political opinion. And I'm concerned about deterring the Taiwanese from believing they have an easy path to a UDI, a Universal Declaration of Independence. And if they assume that under any domestic political circumstances that Uncle Sam will come to the rescue, then I fear we bring on a crisis which the United States may then not deliver on. That's my concern.
But the other option would be to somehow think one could lure Beijing into believing that they could somehow later on take over the country. Yeah. It seems to me we have given up Hong Kong. Yeah, we have. To me, what's going on there is treason to the people. Yeah, and something similar will come. Yeah, for Xi Jinping, the time will be running out. Yeah, he needs 10 years at the most. Yeah. Do you think you can play that game for another 10, 20, 30 years? Yeah,
well,
without being clear, the moment you attack the country, there will be a response.
Thank you. And then we have 10 minutes left, by the way. So, good conversation here. And first,
just to respond to that,
yes,
before we go to the next one.
Yeah.
I'm aware of the logic of the alternative proposition. My argument is one which is the most effective or least effective in preserving the status quo. That is my simple benchmark here, because I want the status quo preferred. I want Taiwan protected. That's my mission. And that's the mission which in fact underpins this book. So therefore, the question becomes not one of mission, but means. By the clarification mechanism you describe, the real concern is, given the dynamics already unleashed in Taiwanese domestic politics, the Taiwanese domestic political actors begin to cross a whole bunch of declaratory red lines around Taiwan's future independence, which causes the Chinese to act militarily early. At present, they don't have that precedent, or they don't have that pretext, and I don't believe they want to cross that line until they're much more militarily prepared. So therefore, my concern about strategic ambiguity being abolished and being clear about strategic intention is that you unleash this third variable. Furthermore, remember in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine's been effectively defended so far in the absence of any formal security guarantee to Ukraine by anybody, including NATO, including the United States bilaterally. They didn't even have a Taiwan Relations Act to equivalent in the case of Ukraine. What did Ukraine's ultimate success hinge on? The Taiwanese effectively constructing their own national defence capability, acting as an effective porcupine to slow down the Russian advance and push it from central Ukraine to eastern Ukraine. Therefore, another reason for sustaining strategic ambiguity is to cause the Taiwanese to conclude they must increase their national defence preparedness. And they have routinely and I think stubbornly and stupidly not done so for a very long period of time. The Americans don't say this publicly, but I'm not a public official at the moment. I'm a think tanker. And let me tell you, there's a degree of frustration about Taiwan's non-attention to its own national security needs. And thirdly, to keep this away from the boiling point, and I'm deeply conscious of what's happened in Hong Kong and the effective death and destruction of one country, two systems with the abolition of civil liberties through the agency of the national security law in Hong Kong, is that the Taiwanese also need to have a more dexterous playbook, including a political dialogue channel with the Chinese as well. Otherwise, everything is forced into the military channel, which then gets forced into the American channel, which means we go from nothing to automatic escalation into a US-China conflict. I'm all for, shall we say, maximal de-escalation across the board, at the same time as building effective levels of deterrence against a Chinese challenge medium to long term. Is it perfect? No. Is it less risky than what you suggest, sir? In my argument, yes.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My question is, you have listed these wonderful babushka dolls naming Xi Jinping's wishes. Now, I wonder, wish list is one thing, but how realistic is it? In a sense, like Miko already touched on, that was, I think, doll number 3, growing the economy, which is weakening, though. You have a growing joblessness amongst young people, you have the lie-down movement, you have a lot of dissatisfaction with the zero-COVID strategy. So from the internal perspective, how secure or how firm is Xi Jinping's grip on power? Is it like, it sounds, listening to you, it sounds as if there's an absolute given, but I wonder if it is.
No, I wasn't describing whether each of these would succeed. The purpose of my babushka dolls, or what I describe elsewhere as concentric circles of interest, is to describe what Xi Jinping is doing. And the reason I'm doing that is so that we can understand what he's doing, so that we can therefore frame our response accordingly, each of us in our own different ways. On a separate question is, what's the report card on progress or regress in each of those 10 areas? I don't think in our remaining 3 minutes I've got time to go through it. But if you went across the 10, there is significant progress and in some cases some regress. And the one you've pointed to in terms of the fragilities in the economy is classic for a reason. And the social contract, which is not just improving living standards through increased economic opportunities, but also a social life which is a better life for all Chinese. And when you're being locked down arbitrarily by the state, if you're a person who's been in a same-sex relationship, if you're a Chinese gay guy who's now told to man up and become part of a masculine culture, if you're a Chinese religious organisation just had your church knocked over or your temple destroyed or your mosque closed, and if you are someone in a Chinese unofficial newsletter or media outlet from a non-government organisation which has been shut down, or a Christian pastor who's been imprisoned, all these things add up to challenges about whether this social contract, unfolded gradually by Deng, Zhang and Hu, is in the same state of repair. My argument over the top of it, however, is because Xi Jinping in babushka doll number 1, power of the party, power of me within the party, and the technology of the Chinese surveillance state and the surveillance and control mechanisms now available to him, has a remarkable set of advantages which Lenin didn't have, which Stalin didn't have, which other totalitarian leaders like Mao did not have. So his ability to control, notwithstanding the social forces which are being unleashed by his repressive strategies on Chinese society and soft politics, as well as what he's doing in the economy, his ability to control dissent is being enhanced by the surveillance and control systems now at his disposal. I still think these represent forces for long-term change, but I don't think we should have a view that it's about to catalyse into a movement to prevent Xi Jinping from being reappointed on the 16th of October, or even maybe 5 years later. But as a good dialectician, Xi Jinping, always looking at where the forces for change are coming from in the reverse direction. Unhappy entrepreneurs, unhappy religionists, Christian or Buddhist, unhappy people whose living standards have suddenly become stagnant, makes for an unhappy social contract longer term.
Kevin, we have learned a lot from you today about specific issues, including the Taiwan Straits challenge, about the importance of deterrence and diplomacy, or diplomacy buttressed and supported by deterrence. We've learned about the importance of getting Xi Jinping's policies and perspectives right and understanding the central role of ideology in that. We've also learned that your theory of change starts with good analysis. But if there's one thing that you want to leave a German audience and a European audience with here tonight in terms of what we really need to get right in getting our own China strategies aligned, as you know, the German government is currently drafting its own China strategy. In addition to what you've said already, or maybe something that you want to stress again, what is it that we need to take away from you today for our own China strategy development?
I think it is this, that, and I'm not saying this to be polite because I'm in Berlin, but Germany's voice really matters. There are a few countries in the world which the Chinese pay much attention to. One, obviously, is the United States. Second is Japan. Third is India. But coming into the close fourth is Berlin, because this country is seen as strong and powerful and credible in Europe. And therefore, what you say and do as Germany on these big questions matters. As you said, none of us are bystanders. And therefore, it's not possible to just stand quietly to one side on these things. Least of all here, because it really does matter what you say and do. And when you act in a particular direction, whether it's on the deterrence questions widely cast, as I said before, or whether it's contributing to European Union or NATO postures on China for the future, where you go and lead nationally, and if you like bilaterally with China, I think you'll be surprised at how much of Europe actually follows in your wake. So my encouragement for our friends in Germany is that through long study of how the Chinese regard other nation states, Germany is within the top 5 in the world. Not Brussels, Berlin. There you go.
Kevin, this is a big responsibility. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today and being with us. Thanks to the audience for good questions and your attendance tonight. We wish you a very good night here in Berlin and hope to be back with more insights and analysis in our MERICS Future China Lecture series. Thank you so much.